Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Michelle Cook, and I serve as the University of Georgia's Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion and Strategic University Initiatives. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second annual Judge Horace J. Johnson Jr. Lecture on Race, Law, and Policy. This lecture series honors a trailblazer for the Black community and for the legal profession. It is supported by the university's Presidential Task Force on Race, Ethnicity, and Community, the School of Law, and the School of Public and International Affairs, to honor the late jurist Horace Johnson Jr. From an early age, Judge Johnson was a pioneer for justice. As a fourth grader, he was one of 5 students who helped desegregate public schools in Newton County, Georgia. He went on to earn degrees from Oxford College of Emory University, Emory University's Gazetta Business School, and the University of Georgia School of Law, where he earned his JD in 1982. He entered private practice in Atlanta and later returned to Newton County, where he became the first Black attorney to practice. In 2002, he was appointed by then Governor Roy Barnes as the first Black Superior Court judge to serve in the Alcovy Judicial Circuit. He remained in this role until his untimely death in July of 2020. Judge Johnson had many firsts attached to his name, but he was first and foremost a man of integrity, a man of compassion, and a man who devoted his life to service. His many civic contributions include serving as past president of the Arts Association of Newton County, helping establish a mentoring program, and serving as the board of directors of the Washington Street Community Center in Covington, Georgia. It is our sincere hope that this lecture series will help inspire future generations to follow in Judge Johnson's footsteps, whether through the legal profession or through a range of other fields. Judge Johnson's legacy is one of commitment to the greater good, and it can live on through the good that others do. Introducing today's speakers is Dean Matthew Auer. Dr. Auer is Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs and Arch Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. Under Dean Auer's leadership, the School of Public and International Affairs continues to rank among the top 10 public affairs programs in the country and was ranked 7th globally among top programs in public administration. Dean Auer, I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. It's always good to be with you, and it's such a delight to be in company today with Professor George and Professor West. Just a little bit about our honored guest today. Robert George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton. He has served as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the President's Council on Bioethics. He has also served as the U.S. representative to UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology, and he was a judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. He's the recipient of the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal, the Honorific Medal for the Defense of Human Rights from the Republic of Poland, the Canterbury Medal of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, the Irving Kristol Award of the American Enterprise Institute, and Princeton University's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. He's the author of many articles and many books. His books include Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, and In Defense of Natural Law, and also The Clash of Orthodoxies, and Conscience and Its Enemies. Welcome, Dr. George.
Thank you very much, Dean.
Dr. West is an American philosopher, a political activist, social critic, public intellectual, and he is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Chair at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He is former professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University and professor emeritus at Princeton. Over the years, he has taught courses in classical studies, philosophy of religion, African-American critical thought, cultural theory, literature, and music. Professor West has authored 20 books and edited 13 others. His titles include Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and his memoir, Brother West, Living and Living Out Loud, Most recently, he authored Black Prophetic Fire. Dr. West is a frequent commentator on news and cable, and he's also the recipient of more than 20 honorary degrees, as well as the American Book Award. And his fan base, I would say, rivals that of the national champion University of Georgia football team. Welcome, Dr. George and Dr. West. Folks who are tuning in, please know that the chat is disabled, but we certainly welcome that you use the Q&A, the question and answer, to pose questions to our panelists. We do have a few already. Yesterday, the Knight Foundation Ipsos poll came out, which has come out every year since 2016, that deals with students' perceptions of their free speech rights on campus and just in life generally. That poll shows that students of all stripes, but in particular, major declines with, for example, Black students, with Republicans, feel that their rights to free speech, their First Amendment rights, are less secure than ever on campus and just in ordinary life. At the same time, on our campuses, we have the continual struggle of trying to have students feel that they can engage one another in vigorous debate and discussion on topics that really matter to them, including the topics that we're covering today: race, equal justice before the law, policy, et cetera. I guess the question then for both of you would be, how do we reverse these trends? How do we have students feel that, in fact, they can engage in free speech and they should feel comfortable on our campuses engaging in open exchange of ideas on matters that really matter to them, including on issues of race? Perhaps we could begin with Dr. West.
Oh, okay. I'm used to my dear brother Robbie starting, but I will follow instruction from our dean. Thank you so very much for the kind introduction. I want to salute my dear sister Michelle, Dr. Cook, who's one of the most distinguished graduates of Princeton. I knew her as an undergrad, and just a beautiful thing to see her flower and flourish. University of Georgia is so blessed to have her, and of course Horace Johnson Jr. He's one of the great pioneers, and not just Georgia, but of American law, and salute him and his family. And anytime I'm in conversation with Brother Robbie, I know I always have a great time. We just have a joyful conviviality together. But no, I think we have to begin with the notion that a law school is going to be deeply shaped by the larger environment of the country, and the country is undergoing levels of spiritual decay and moral decrepitude. And what I mean by that is increasing callousness, increasing coldness, a deep distrust of one another, a despair that we can ever really reach some kind of context in which we can engage in conversation mediated with respect. And you see that in the larger society. You're going to see it at the law school, University of Georgia. The question always is, how do we create countervailing forces against that? And the way you do it, I think, is just through example. People have to be able to see persons who can look the callousness, who can look the indifference in the face and say, I'm going to be empathetic. I'm going to reach out. I'm going to conceive of what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes. I'm going to try to hold up a banner of integrity and honesty. And so it's through the examples, it's through the praxis that you constitute countervailing forces against this kind of coldness that we hope, would enact the Negro National Anthem, the anthem of my own Black folk, which is lift every voice. We've got to allow voices to be lifted, left wing, right wing, centrist, cross ideology, cross religion, cross color, cross class, cross sexual orientation, across national boundaries. We got international students from all around the world. And the bottom line, I think, ought to be this Imago Dei, this sense of all recognizing that we're made in the image of a God bigger than us. And therefore we have a certain sanctity and dignity. And if you're not in any way religious, that's fine. Just understand it in terms of some kind of equal respect, some content, some other philosophical language that stays in contact with the humanity of each and every one of us. Brother Robbie, you want to jump on it?
Yeah, thank you, Cornel. First, I do want to express my gratitude to Dr. Cook and to Dean Auer for the invitation to be part of today's event, especially because it gives us an opportunity to honor a great figure in the law and a great pioneer, as Dr. Cook rightly described him. And it's a blessing and an honor to participate in honoring Judge Johnson and his legacy and his memory. And I join Professor West in saluting his family. And what a joy it is, as always, to be with my beloved brother, Cornel West, our nation's premier public intellectual, and my dear, dear, dear beloved friend and brother. Cornel and I have been working together, teaching together, writing together, arguing together, singing together, praying together, now for more than a decade and a half. And this work that we do together and this friendship, which is a friendship not only between two individuals, but two families. Cornel, just a week and a half ago, with his wonderful wife, Anahita, was at my son David's wedding in Los Angeles. Cornel's beloved daughter, brilliant daughter, Zaytun, is here with me at Princeton. She could have gone to Harvard to study there, where her daddy was a few years ago, but she chose instead to come study where her Uncle Robbie is at Princeton. She made the right decision, I always say. So it is a blessing to be with Cornel, and not only because he's a beloved friend, but because he is such an inspiring witness. He was just talking about the importance of role models, of examples. Well, here he is. Here's one person who exemplifies every day integrity, wisdom, honesty, courage. And I'm going to be talking a bit about those virtues in just a minute to respond specifically to Dean Auer's question. So what do we need? What do we need if we're to restore, let's begin with our academic institutions, whether it's Princeton, Union Theological Seminary, Harvard, University of Georgia. What can we do to restore them, or to make them, in many cases, really for the first time, true centers of civil discourse and robust debate, so that they can fulfill what we need to remind ourselves constantly is their ultimate mission, their defining purpose: truth seeking, seeking knowledge of the truth. In our research, in our teaching our students to be lifelong learners, lifelong pursuers of truth. Well, for those institutions to fulfill that role, to prosecute that mission, certain conditions need to be in place. One thing is formal freedoms. Formal freedoms. The rules have to be that we allow every voice to be heard. Cornel invokes the great national anthem, the great anthem of Black people, lift every voice. That's got to be real. That's got to be part of the rules. We at Princeton have the University of Chicago free speech principles, and I commend them to every institution so that every voice can be lifted. But words on paper are not enough. Cornel and I were talking about this just yesterday. We were recalling that the Soviet Constitution, if you just look at words on paper, Stalin's Soviet Constitution sounded great. I mean, it had a magnificent Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. All false. All false, but the words were there. Now, what that shows us is the words are not enough. You need a culture that is supportive of every voice being lifted, of robust engagement. And for that, you need role models as well as formal principles. Now, something that I have heard Cornel say time and again that is so important, and he exemplifies this in the teaching we do together with our students. He has said to our young men and women, don't think that you are here at Princeton or at Harvard or at University of Georgia, that you are here to be reinforced in what you already believe. That's not our job as educators. You are here to be unsettled. Man, that takes him back for a moment. You're here to be unsettled. And Cornel even takes it to the next step. A liberal education, a liberal arts education, is not only meant to unsettle you rather than reinforce you. It's meant to teach you how to die. I once heard Cornel say that to a group of freshman parents. This is what we're here to do for your young men and women. Well, they were a bit curious, a little concerned about what that meant. But he explained, hearkening back to Plato, If you want to learn how to live, it has to be a consideration from the perspective of death, where we're not concerned about what's on our CV, power, wealth, status, influence, prestigious degrees, and so forth, but what's on our tombstone. What kind of heart did you have? What kind of mind did you have? What were you devoted to? Were you a truth seeker? Did you seek the truth in love? And we need to build a culture within our institutions where that kind of truth seeking is modeled, exemplified, and where no one thinks that they are there to be reinforced or to be made comfortable, but rather they're to be unsettled. When Cornel and I teach together or separately, I've seen him separately, such a brilliant teacher. I don't care whether the student is right, left, center, religious, secular, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, no matter where that student's coming from, that student is going to read things and hear things that are disturbing, maybe even offensive, maybe that he or she will consider outrageous, but it's going to happen to every student because we're going to make sure that they're reading Nietzsche and also Aristotle, that they're reading Du Bois and Hayek and Lewis and St. Augustine and Sophocles, all sorts of different perspectives. They're going to be encountering the great Islamic philosophers of the Middle Ages, the great Jewish thinkers, the great Christian thinkers, secularists, atheist thinkers, people on the left, people on the right, people arguing for views that were considered outrageous in their time, which have become accepted, people who are arguing for views today that are considered outrageous, sometimes by people on the left, sometimes by people on the right. But we don't know where society is going to go on those. And where society goes doesn't really matter because we can always be wrong, and we need to remind ourselves and remind our students we can always be wrong. We're fallible, which is why it never makes sense to shut down a point of view, a perspective, no matter how outrageous. All we ask, and I'll conclude with this point, Dean Auer, all we ask, all Cornel and I ask, is that business be conducted in our classrooms in the proper currency of intellectual discourse, a currency consisting of reasons, arguments, and evidence. No name calling, no abuse, but freedom to defend any point of view, no matter how upsetting it might be, disturbing, unsettling, so long as business is conducted in that currency.
Thank you both. We've got some great questions coming in. There's considerable interest in the fact that on Monday, the Supreme Court agreed to hear oral arguments. I think those will probably take place in the fall, that challenge the race conscious admissions policies of Harvard University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. With a conservative supermajority in place, let's assume for the sake of argument that the plaintiff wins in this case. And let's further assume that you were hired by, this has implications for universities and colleges across the country. You're hired by a university that has also engaged in race-conscious admissions practices. You're hired as a team, the two of you, to help advise on this sort of post-Supreme Court decision landscape. What would you recommend that universities do as they're composing their classes, their new cohorts of matriculants that are coming into their universities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a major challenge to think like an administrator. That's usually my disposition. But I can say something about what I would hope would be the framework for any serious administrator who has to deal with these issues of policy. Brother Robbie is right that any institution of higher learning has to be fundamentally committed to a quest for truth and goodness and beauty, and therefore we're concerned about the quality of critical intelligence of any prospective student. At the same time, we're living in a world, in the real world, and we've had some very vicious legacies of white supremacy and male supremacy and other ideologies that lose sight of the humanity of folk who haven't had access to the kind of fair assessments as to the quality of their intelligence. So the question becomes, how do we remain committed to quality of mind, at the same time committed to diversity of persons owing to mechanisms in the past and present that make it difficult for poor students and Black students, indigenous students, brown students, and so forth. And we have to be able to walk that tightrope. It's so easy to fall back into business as usual. And business as usual, as we know, at a Princeton, the only acceptable Ivy League for Southerners, right? And for Union Seminary, University of Georgia, Holmes, Hunter, that powerful moment in the history of this grand institution in which you got high quality folk who had been excluded. So how do we somehow allow for a conversation? And as Brother Robbie said, it's going to cut across the grain. I mean, I fundamentally believe in fighting for the right for persons who I think are wrong, because I know there's going to be moments in which I'm wrong. There's going to be persons who disagree with affirmative action in this regard. And yet we have to be able to allow for that dialogue to take place. And I would hope that administrators could reach a point where they have a consensus, where they're committed simultaneously, quality of mind, diversity of students.
Yes, let me follow up on that. If in fact we move at the level of national law, including perhaps national constitutional law, to the point where, say, California is as a matter of state law now as a result of referenda, and I think Michigan's in the same position where race can't be taken into account, that does not mean that diversity is being abandoned or that diversity must be abandoned. We could, and I think should, I think this is much better than race-based admissions, be looking for people, young men and women, potential students, in whom we perceive exceptional talent and promise, who have simply not had the advantages and the opportunities that would ordinarily put them into the top pool for admissions. If you're looking at me, you're looking at such a person when I was a youngster. I grew up in the hills of West Virginia. I was the first generation to go to, I was first in my family to go to college. I was not ready, honestly, for a rigorous undergraduate education of the sort that I found on offer when I arrived at Swarthmore College as an 18-year-old with literally banjo on my back. I wasn't shoeless. I sometimes use that as a metaphor. I arrived shoeless with a banjo on my back. I wasn't literally shoeless, but I literally had a banjo on my back. But I was struggling that first semester and really for the whole of that first year, because the kids from Andover and Exeter and St. Paul's and the great public high schools in places like Chevy Chase, Maryland, and Bethesda and so forth knew things that I didn't even suspect, much less know. They were familiar with ideas, with figures from history and literature. They had had advanced courses, AP and all that sort of thing, that I didn't have the opportunity to have. But somehow Swarthmore perceived in me, even as an applicant, some ability. I'm sure that the director of admissions knew when he admitted this kid from Appalachia, the kid from the hills of West Virginia, that he was going to have a tough first year. And he might have wondered whether I'd make it, as I wondered myself as I was going through it, whether I would make it. I did, thanks to the blessing of two professors who perceived some talent in me that wasn't evident in my exam answers on midterms, but they believed was there, and they brought me along, and soon they had me flying, and I've been able to have the academic career that I've been so blessed to enjoy. That's the kind of thing we need to be looking for. And it doesn't matter whether it's a kid like myself from Arabic heritage, Syrian heritage from Appalachia, or whether it's a Black kid from Chicago, a Latino kid from Albuquerque. It just doesn't matter where that kid is. Out there are thousands upon thousands of young men and women of exceptional talent who haven't yet had the opportunity to develop it and put it on display. We're going to have to do admissions in a new way that focuses on finding those kids, A, because they deserve it, and B, because they have so much to offer the other kids at the colleges and universities that they will be attending. So really, this is better than doing it on the basis of skin color or race or something like that. find the kids of all backgrounds and races who've got it, but just haven't been able to develop it. And then give them the resources, give them the understanding and the education that will enable them to fly. We'll be so proud of ourselves if we do this.
Thank you. Professors, just as our proceedings were starting, the news hit that Justice Breyer is likely to step down from the Supreme Court. And our audience is tuned into that. And one of them asks, what questions should the Senate ask nominees? And what qualifications does a nominee need to have to make sure racial justice can be protected in issues like criminal justice and more?
This is news. This is real breaking news, not that superficial breaking news we often get on television. Wow. I mean, these days, though, when you think of the Senate, you think much more of Machiavelli than you do Plato. Or you think more of Thrasymachus than you do Socrates, which is to say, it's just a play of power. It's unfortunate that oftentimes the dialogues that take place are more sophistic, just ways of concealing power moves rather than genuine reason-giving activities that have some kind of critical gravitas in terms of trying to persuade people, trying to make a case for people. So in an ideal setting in the Senate committee, you would hope that people would be fundamentally committed to some serious conceptions of the role of law in public life. We're living in a moment now where the Supreme Court is wrestling with a legitimation crisis. More and more of our fellow citizens no longer even believe in its legitimacy because it looks as if it's just power all the way down, rather than serious critical reflection on the role of the law in public life that affects all of us as citizens who can enter public space without humiliation and engage in a trustworthy conversation. So that, and we've talked to Brother Roberts about this, and Robbie received the award. He was kind enough to bring me in. He had Harriet Tubman's Bible, and Robbie was sworn in, and we were there in Roberts's office a week before I had actually been arrested in front of the court. So that same policeman that saw me the Monday before said, "Weren't you the person that just got arrested?" I said, "Yeah, but I'm with my brother." And we walked right in with Supreme Court with Brother Roberts. But Roberts was very, very concerned about this issue that we talked to him about, legitimacy. And so I think we got two levels here. You got the meta level, meta law, which is the legitimacy of the court, the legitimacy of the rule of law. And then you've got what happens within the context of the law. And you're hoping that the Senate could speak to both of those levels in such a way that it would generate some higher trust that we should have in the rule of law being much more fair than it is at present.
This is news to me as well. It's the first time hearing it. Obviously, big news for the country. Earlier this week, Dr. Cook's fellow Princeton alumna, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, gave a speech that got a good deal of publicity in which she talked about how hard the questions are that come before the Supreme Court. She's concerned that too many people in the public think that these questions are easy or the answers are obvious, and that people who don't come down the way they would prefer must have some malign or malicious motives. And Justice Sotomayor warned people, no, that's not it. These are hard issues. That's how they get to the Supreme Court. They don't get to the Supreme Court unless they're hard issues. They get to the Supreme Court because there's disagreement, and often disagreement at the lower court levels. Very often the way a case ends up being taken by the Supreme Court, only a small fraction of cases, tiny fraction of cases that are presented to the court are actually taken by the court. Very often the way they end up taking the case, the justices, is where there's a conflict in the lower courts, a conflict at the next level down in the federal system, the so-called circuit courts. So on the same issue, let's say the Ninth Circuit out in California has ruled one way, and the Second Circuit in New York has ruled another way. So the law is two different things in the United States. The same United States law, the same provision of the U.S. Code, the same provision of the U.S. Constitution means something different in the two parts of the United States. Obviously, that can't be allowed to stand. And so the Supreme Court then is forced to come in and deal with a case on which reasonable justices, learned men and women, honest men and women have disagreed. So we need to remember that. Now, on the specific question having to do with racial justice, there are particular areas of the Constitution and federal statutory law where particular attention should be paid. Obviously, constitutionally, the 14th Amendment matters, especially in the interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause. Now, in doing that, we need to remember what Justice Sotomayor has warned us about. Reasonable people disagree about the meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. Does it require color blindness? That's the Harvard case. The people bringing the case against Harvard's race-conscious admissions policies are Asians who are arguing that those policies end up discriminating against Asians. Other people, of course, other justices see it differently. If we look at the history of interpretation in this area, the Supreme Court is often divided 5-4. So even on the court itself, there's profound division. But we would certainly want to know of a nominee, all right, where do you come down on the proper interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and why do you come down there? Do you think we should take an originalist approach, be guided by the original public meaning? Or do you take a different approach? Is there a structural approach? Is there some other approach? Well, what is it? And even within these families or families of approaches, let's say originalism, there are competing points of view. Okay, people who say we should be guided by the original public meaning may disagree about what that original public meaning was. There's a wonderful debate between Michael McConnell of Stanford Law School and Earl Maltz of Rutgers Law School, two very distinguished originalist legal scholars who disagree about what the public meaning was of the 14th Amendment at the time of its ratification. They agree we should be guided by the original public meaning, but disagree as to what it was. So that question's got to be asked. Okay, what else? Still at the constitutional level. Obviously, Fourth Amendment. Fourth Amendment. So much of our law concerning criminal procedure, the rights of people accused of crimes. And then the Fifth Amendment, the Due Process Clause. Sixth and Seventh Amendments are relevant here as well. And if you look at these criminal law rulings, you will find that they do not break strictly along ideological lines with the Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other. Neil Gorsuch tends to vote with Elena Kagan on some of these criminal procedure laws, criminal procedure cases, these Fourth Amendment cases, for example. And then if we move to the statutory area, certainly the interpretation of the major civil rights statutes, like Civil Rights Act of 1964, are highly relevant. What is the nominee's understanding of those provisions, the key provisions of the Civil Rights Acts, these statutes? And then, of course, always hovering in the background, there's the question of the proper distribution or proper relationship of federal power and state power, including on issues pertaining to race. Historically, that has always been a central issue. Now, complicating all of this, of course, is the question, what should nominees be willing to talk about when it comes to cases or issues that might come before the nominee if the nominee is in fact confirmed and made a justice? Initially, another Princeton alumna here, Dr. Cook, initially Elena Kagan, before she was nominated, and she's a dear friend of mine and I love her, she originally took the view that nominees should be more forthcoming. They should talk more, be willing to talk more openly about cases that might come before the court. And she published work that was advocating that. But then when she herself was nominated, she changed her mind. She, in accounting for herself, she said that she had been persuaded by one of the Republican senators. It was the senator from Utah at the time. I'm trying to remember his name, who persuaded her that the established policy of which he had been critical was actually the better policy, that a nominee should absolutely strictly refuse to speak on any matter, any case, any issue that might then in the future come before her if she's confirmed as a justice. To tell you the truth, put my own cards on the table, I think Elena Kagan was right the first time. I think the nominees should be more willing to talk about issues that might come before them. Less, if I can use this word, they should be less coy. Now, I do have limits. I don't want any justice promising to rule a certain way. I think that would be very bad. In my home state of West Virginia, a Supreme Court justice once did that. He just made a promise he's never going to vote against a worker in a workman's compensation case. Now that's really bad. I wouldn't be for that. But I do think that there's too much hiding by our nominees, Republican, Democrat, left, right, too much hiding behind this principle that we shouldn't be commenting on cases that might come before the court. I think they should be much more forthcoming, considerably in any event, considerably more forthcoming when it comes to the issues that are, after all, so central in their importance to all of us.
Thanks very much for that. Interesting questions coming in. I think one of our audience members was struck by comments that you had made earlier, Dr. George, about being the first in your family to go to college. So the question is, could you both tell us about kids from underprivileged backgrounds that you've mentored who made it, and could you tell us about some who did not?
No, I'm still just taking in Brother Robbie's response. You can see why I have such a great time in the classroom with him, because his brilliance in moving the free play of intelligence that on bouncing around these different issues is just it's a beautiful thing to be a part of, even when he's wrong. It's just a beautiful thing to observe and be a part of. And I don't think he was wrong in this case, but I mean, we've got our own ideological agreements, but our love and respect for each other is so much deeper. But I've been blessed to be a part of a number. At this point, it's in the hundreds of students who I've been able to spend time with, try to encourage, affirm them, encourage them, let them know not just that as individuals, they have a sense of possibility in the sky's the limit, but also from whence they come, their parents, their mosques, their churches, their synagogues, their civic institutions, their athletic connections, their musical affiliations. All of this goes into the making and shaping of who they are so that they can muster a level of self-respect and self-confidence such that they can be all that they can be. And so anytime you talk about, like Brother Robbie, right, from Appalachia, coal mining, and my God, if you got a chance to meet his father and his mother, you'd understand who he is at the deepest level. Now his mom and dad didn't go to Oxford like he did, but probably 3 Oxford passed through them in terms of deep wisdom, spirit, integrity, and so forth. So that it's a sense of having a larger conception of oneself. And when it doesn't happen, when people are unable to execute, that's part of life. There's always failure goes hand in hand with success. Breakthroughs go hand in hand with relative collapse. The question is bounce back. All of us in our individual lives fail. And even when we succeed, that wonderful essay by Tennessee Williams after the Glass Menagerie hit Broadway, The Catastrophe of Success. Even when you think you're so successful, there's catastrophe written in it if you don't attend to it. And so our conceptions of success and failure have to be recast as we try to continue this journey called life from womb to tomb.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. I am happy to say I can't think off the top of my head of any major failures among my students who've come from backgrounds like my own, or in some cases even more challenging than my own. But if I could quickly just tell you about 3 people that I find really inspiring. People who know Princeton probably figure out who I'm talking about here. I'm trying to protect their names and identities for their privacy, although I'm going to be praising them because they so richly deserve it. One was a young man, Puerto Rican background. His father was in military, and the family moved around the country. They were not poor. Military's a reasonably good work, good job, good pay. But they certainly weren't rich. The family did not have education, higher education background. And the moving around, I think, was a bit tough on this kid. No sooner you make one set of friends, then you have to move and have to make another set of friends. And when he arrived at Princeton, he was definitely insecure. And he showed that insecurity by wearing a chip right there on his shoulder. And I perceived it right away. I perceived A, that he was smart, but B, that he had a chip on his shoulder. I knew that there had to be some reason for that. So as I got to know him, learned about the family background and the moving around and so forth, and he's trying to find his way at Princeton, things began to become clear. And part of the chip on the shoulder was that he would argue very fiercely in our class discussions, and from time to time maybe be guilty of a little bit getting too much like bullying in these class discussions. Not really listening to what the other students who disagreed with him said about this, but really forcefully trying to get his opinion out there. So my job was to get him to listen, to consider that he might be wrong about this or that or the other thing. In this particular case, he's a conservative kid. He was arguing for conservative values, and I'm conservative myself, and I was trying to get him to be more open to the other point of view, to the more progressive point of view, or at least give progressive students a chance to make their arguments to him. But boy, he just came along so beautifully. Just so beautifully. Part of that was a spiritual experience. He got involved with the campus Catholic ministry, and his faith really deepened. And as he became more confident that he could in fact compete, that he could make the arguments, as he became more confident, he became willing to listen more. The bullying type of attitude was a result of insecurity, not being confident enough, not the opposite, not being too confident. And he was able intellectually and spiritually to overcome that. And this kid, when at graduation time, I put it metaphorically, his mom and dad had to rent a U-Haul truck to haul away all the honors and awards that he got at graduation. Absolutely nobody would have predicted that when that kid walked through the door at Princeton. I'll tell you about another young woman, not at Princeton. This is a young woman I ran into when I was speaking at a university down in Texas. And she attended my talk, and then the discussion with student groups that I had afterward. And she was really interested in political theory, very interested in political theory, Latino, Mexican background, really quite poor. And I perceived in her just a ton of talent. I just got interested in her. And so we stayed in touch, and she shared with me the confidence that her real goal in life, what she'd really love to do, would be to go on for a PhD in political theory and become a scholar, become a political theory scholar. But there were all sorts of potential obstacles. How do you finance something like that? Will my parents understand it? Will my parents understand my going away to university somewhere where I'm not close to the family? And this is a different world for her than it is for many of us today. More like the world that I myself came from. I could sympathize with it. And the beautiful story here is, gosh, she went off to Notre Dame, did brilliantly, completed her PhD. Now she's a tenured professor, just about to get tenure at her university. She has still had some struggles, health issues in her family, and so forth. Some of those have to do with economic background as well. But it's a story of triumph. And then the third, very quickly, a story of a young African-American woman, Black woman. This is back at Princeton. I got to know not because she was in my classes. She was in the sciences, I believe, chemistry. I think she was a biochemistry concentrator. And but here she came to my attention because in a period of some uproar on campus where racial issues were in the forefront, she found herself dissenting from views that a lot of people thought she should hold or was somehow obligated to hold because of the color of her skin, because she was Black. The expectation was she would be on a certain side, and she wasn't there. That's not where she was. And she was bold enough, brave enough to be outspoken. And she was particularly vilified. And there's no avoiding this statement. She was vilified in a way that a white student wouldn't have been. She was vilified because she was Black and not, quote, thinking Black or acting Black. She was derided by her critics. She was referred to as Aunt Jemima, and I found this just absolutely outrageous. So I became involved with her and tried to give her some support. Our university did a very good job of providing her support when she was mistreated in ways that the university could rectify and did rectify. But there are the beautiful stories. She just did not let it get her down. She would not be intimidated. She would not back off. She would stand her ground, tell the truth as best she understood the truth, realizing she could be wrong, but she was willing to dissent and not be forced to think and talk in a way that was inauthentic, that wasn't what she actually believed. Those are the stories that make it wonderful to be a teacher, to do what Cornel and I and you do. I mean, gosh, even one of those would make it all worthwhile, but we can all think of many.
Picking up on your last remarks, a participant has either coincidentally or just hearing what you've just mentioned, Dr. George, writes, as a Black law student, I am commonly faced with the burden of advocating for social justice, constructive social change in every space that I enter, including the law school. Dr. West, what are your thoughts on it being every law student / lawyer's job to advocate for equality, diversity, and inclusion within the legal profession and greater society?
I appreciate that question. Actually, I was also thinking of the example of Sister Michelle herself, Dr. Cook herself, who I met as an undergrad, who was blessed to have conversations with her after taking the classes. And as she might recall, for me, it's always a question of moral and spiritual witness. Moral and spiritual witness, and that's a choice that doesn't come as a function of skin pigmentation. It's a function of spiritual formation, ethical cultivation, and then the kind of courageous action that Brother Robbie's talking about. So that any interaction with a student, it could be a brilliant undergrad at Princeton like Sister Michelle. I'm not talking about Michelle Obama, I'm talking about Michelle Garfield, who's now Dr. Cook. Both of them brilliant. We talking about this Michelle, but I think that's the crucial thing. You see that, you take somebody like Clarence Thomas, a beautiful Black man. He's got isolated moments of great wisdom. I have deep ideological and political differences with him in terms of his policy. He tends to be tied, for me, much more to the strong and the powerful rather than the vulnerable. But his understanding is different than mine in terms of how do you empower the vulnerable. So we have to wrestle with that. But when I interact with Brother Clarence, he's making moral and spiritual choices. I'm making moral and spiritual choices. I'm not looking at him as two Black brothers who's supposed to agree with each other and sing in harmony like the Temptations. No, no. He is a human being that comes out of a rich tradition of Jim Crow, Georgia. He's a Catholic brother. He's shaped in a certain kind of way. He's making moral and spiritual choices. I'm from Gut Bucket Baptist, chocolate side of Sacramento, California. Black Panther Party, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker. That's informing who I am. So when we come together, I've only met Clarence once in the airport and gave him a hug and had a wonderful conversation, kept on moving, but we know we agree about 3% of the time. That's fine. But I encounter him as a moral and spiritual person who happens to have beautifully Black skin, who happens to be wrong most of the time politically from my point of view. He encounters me in the same way. That's what I would say to the Black student. Don't think that just as a matter of skin pigmentation, you need to be a social justice advocate. If so, you'll never be a marathoner. You're gonna be a sprinter. because it's not in your heart and soul. It's just a gesture. It's a posture. And we need the real thing. Robbie is the real thing. He says what he means. He means what he says. He's a conservative brother, my conservative brother. I try to say what I mean and mean what I say, but it's as a moral and spiritual person that you do that.
Nothing to add other than thanking Cornel for that kind compliment. If what he says is true about me, it is in large measure because of the inspiration that I've received from him. But nobody should be thinking that because you are Black or Asian or white or Latino, that you've got to think a certain way or be on a certain side of the great issues on which reasonable people of goodwill disagree. We should not try to constrain our fellow human beings in that way. They need to be free to think for themselves. In the program that I directed, Prince and I had the honor of founding, the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. We have a motto, and it's the motto that really guides Cornel and myself in our teaching together and our teaching individually. And that motto is it's three principles. Think deeply, think critically, including self-critically, and think for yourself. There's some things you cannot outsource. Some things you can, but there's some things you can't. And thinking is one of those. You cannot outsource it. You mustn't suppose I've got to think a certain way because I'm an Appalachian. I got to think a certain way because I'm a Southern. I have to think a certain way because I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. I got to think a certain way because I'm Black, or because I'm a Latino, or my background is Croatian, or whatever it is. We need to liberate ourselves and not constrain or confine people in that way.
You know, as I recall, the University of Georgia is one of the unique institutions whose motto is metaphysical, the inquiry into the nature of things, the teach and serve, inquire into the nature of things. Now, that's a heavy burden.
In rerum
no way you go inquire into the nature of things by just looking at gender and race and class and nation. Of course, any inquiry will be influenced by who you are, influenced by being a Jewish woman, a Black man, and a Arab brother, or a Palestinian sister, whatever it is. But that truth that you're after is going to be bigger than all of those identity labels. And that's why all of this identity politics has to be situated and contextualized in the larger quest for truth and goodness and beauty. And that's why Beck's Beiderbecke can sound so beautiful on the horn after being shaped by Louis Armstrong being a white brother from Iowa.
Yeah.
Or why Robbie could sound so good on the banjo and still be in love with B.B. King. That's a human affair.
Yeah. That's it.
Well, we have time really for barely have time for just one more question. You know, gentlemen, you have been at this for some time now. You've had these joint appearances. You've taught together for years. The question before us is, when you think back to some of the prescriptions and remedies that you were offering when you first began to make these joint appearances, in light of events that have happened or of trends that have developed, when you look back on some of that advice from years ago, do you feel like some of those remedies, are they kind of quaint? Do they need to be updated? Or would you double down on the same advice that you were giving then? Would you double down today?
It's a wonderful question, though. Do you want to jump in, Brother Robbie, or what do you think?
Well, I can, Cornel, as I sit here reflecting on it.
Yeah, I got to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to 2005 when we first started teaching together our initial course on Adventures in Ideas. We began with Sophocles' Antigone, you'll remember.
Absolutely.
We read Plato's dialogue, Gorgias, such an important dialogue. We read St. Augustine's Confessions. Then we took it all the way up, over time. We ended up reading Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, Hayek's critique of Marxism. We read C.S. Lewis, John Dewey, A Common Faith. We read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, Leo Strauss's Natural Right and History. And our message to our students was that you have to recognize that all of these writers are partial. They see the truth as all of us see the truth at best through a glass darkly. They're going to be wrong about some things, but we've got something to learn from them. Even though they radically disagree with each other. Hayek is a critic of Marx, for example. We've got something to learn, and we need to open our minds and not simply categorize figures that are worth listening to in ways that enable us to just dismiss some and not take seriously and try to learn from what they say, even if we think they're fundamentally wrong. I think Marx is fundamentally wrong, but boy, I've learned from reading Marx. People could say the same about Hayek or Nietzsche or St. Thomas Aquinas or Kierkegaard or any of the great thinkers of history. So what was our message to them back in 2015? Open your mind. Listen to arguments you disagree with. Listen to positions you disagree with. Challenge yourself. Allow other people to challenge you. Never try to shut somebody else down. You may have something to learn from them. Remember your own fallibility. Don't treat yourself as infallible. Recognize that right now you got, as every one of us does, some false ideas in his head. And if you're ever going to get those out of your head, you're going to swap them out for true ideas. You need to be open to being challenged. Let people question you. Learn to question yourself. Gosh, Cornel, I wouldn't change any of that. Of course, we didn't face, I think, quite the intensity of the free speech challenges 16, 17 years ago that we're teaching today. There was nothing that I recall being much like the cancellation culture. And I didn't perceive in our students in those days the kind of self-censorship that I think Dean Auer was calling attention to earlier. Our students didn't feel, even if they had views that were out of sync with the main point of view on campus, they didn't feel as though they would put themselves in some danger or their professional futures in some danger, or they would lose all their friends if they expressed a dissenting opinion. But my answer to these new challenges or intensified challenges is to, as the dean put it, double down and say that makes it all the more important that you have the courage and the integrity to listen and learn and consider that you might be wrong and recognize your fallibility and never try to shut somebody down or cancel somebody. See what you can learn from a critic. Don't just dismiss them. Does that sound right?
That's absolutely. No, I think that our fundamental message, and it's been consistent, we could be with young, precious Black students in Dallas from kindergarten to ninth grade. And in some sense, we've had some peak moments with the kindergartners, even more than with law school students, you know what I mean? But it was this sense of a calling, not just a career, a vocation, not just a profession. So that integrity, honesty, decency, generosity, humility sit at the center. Now, for me, those things never go out of style. It's like love, just never go out of style. I don't care what people are saying. I don't care who they are. I don't care what color they are. If you're not talking integrity, honesty, generosity, then somehow your vanguard is vacuous when it comes to spiritual and moral issues. And we've been deeply committed to tradition. So that, you know, when J.K. Chesterton says, tradition is a democracy of the dead. Tradition resists deferring to the small and arrogant oligarchy that consists of those of us walking about. Because so much of greatness is in the past. The Socrateses, the Jesuses, the grandmamas, the Martin Kings, the Dorothy Days, the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschels, the Edward Zaids. We can go on and on and on. The aristocracy, spiritually, politically, spiritually and morally speaking, of the dead. And we steal the quick, the few that are here. The Judge Horace Johnson Jr.'s, spiritually aristocratic, morally courageous, now no longer with the quick. Never forget him. Why? Not because of his Blackness solely, but because of his moral and spiritual quality as a Black man coming out of Newton County. That's what we've been trying to talk about in the last 17, 18 years. And if there is a kind of fundamentalism, of course, we're both Christians, so our fundamentalism has to do with the image of God in each person and loving neighbor as well as enemy. That's a certain kind of fundamentalism we hold on to. A lot of different, that's very different than some of our dear fundamentalist Christians, especially around the southern part of the country, but they're everywhere. There's a certain kind of dogmatism that lose sight of the humanity of those cast as other. The Muslims, the Jews, the Black folk, the gays, the lesbians, the trans, and other. That's something that we're willing to not just live for, but die for. So when we become part of that tradition of the democracy of the dead, just like Horace, they'll remember of the witness that we tried to bear in our own fallible ways, with smiles on our faces, with Robbie with that style from West Virginia, and me with my little style from Sacramento, California.
Well, Doctors West and George, I can tell you with great assurance that Judge Horace J. Johnson Jr. would have been thrilled to have joined us today. And I think he is smiling down on us. What a wonderful, we've gone into overtime, so it's been more than an hour. And if my dear colleague from the law school, Dean Bo Rutledge, and I could figure out a way to get the two of you here on sabbatical leave, I think we probably have to have crowd control. There would be quite a line to get in. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Cook, as well. We will move forward with a lot of ideas to think about here, and hopefully we can do this again in the future. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Indeed. We thank you, Brother Dean. We thank you.
Dean.
You were
Thank you,
wonderful
Dr. Cook.
orchestrating this thing.
Thank you again. Good afternoon.